All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Stephen, are you ready to do this?
I am ready.
All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Stephen Mills. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Guy. Great to be here.
All right. So Stephen is the author of Chosen, a memoir of stolen boyhood, in which he recounts his childhood sexual abuse by a summer camp director, the long, painful process of recovery, and his quest to stop a serial predator and find justice. The New York Times has called the book a searing, haunting, urgent cri de coeur. The Pulitzer-prize-winning novelist Junot Diaz says Chosen is a work of shattering, almost unbearable radiance. It's destined to be a classic because this is a book that will save lives. Since 1983, Stephen has advised and written for an array of public interest organizations in the fields of human rights, civil liberties, and the environment. He's honored to serve as an ambassador for Child USA, the leading nonprofit fighting for the civil rights of children. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
So before we get going here, Stephen, share with the listeners where you are from originally and where you
I'm
are.
originally from New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
And currently, where are you?
Currently live in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I've covered both coasts.
The obvious choice here. All right. So let's kind of jump in here. How the heck? What's going on? How did you get here to write this book?
Yeah, well, it was a long journey, Guy. You know, these are things that happened more than half a century ago when I was 13. And since I went into therapy in my late 20s, I mean, it took me that long, like many male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, you know, we tend to numb the pain by all means possible. And that's something I get into in the book, you know, in terms of where my journey took me. And that was through, you know, drugs and acting out sexually and religion and all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But male survivors tend to, when all else fails, and that includes usually some suicide attempts, reach out in their usually 30s. But for me, through a series of rather dramatic circumstances, I found my way into therapy in my late 20s. And in the course of that, I had the first inklings of wanting to tell this story, but it was pretty inchoate and I couldn't quite get my hands around it. In 1987, when I went to the FBI and the district attorney in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania to try to stop the perpetrator who abused me and many, many other boys. I met with an FBI agent toward the end of that whole journey through law enforcement who said, you know, you're a writer, you should really write about this because people need to know more about it, what the experience of kids is and the impact and the challenges, you know, in getting perpetrators brought to justice. And that planted a seed. But then it took me the better part of 35 years to tell the story, because honestly, and I think any therapist can appreciate this, you know, I had to go down through so many layers of shame and guilt, and there's these feelings of complicity I had in having been sexually assaulted at age 13, that it just took me that long, you know, to peel all of that away and be ready to tell the story. So that took till 2018. That was the first attempt where I sat down and it just happened.
So at 13, this occurred in summer camp over the period of how long?
2 years.
Over a period of 2 years.
The grooming took place over one summer. I mean, like most abusers, this guy was in no hurry. You know, grooming, you know, as opposed to what most people's impression of grooming before sexual abuse is, oh, well, giving the kids gifts or money or some boundary violations. And all of that's true. But in fact, the emotional, psychological grooming is what's really at the core of it. And that takes place very gradually. That's really a building of trust. The perpetrator is building this bond of trust and dependence. And that took all of a summer. And then the following fall, he conned my mother into letting him take me up to camp in the off season, whereas basically in the woods, 100 miles from home, alone with him. That's where the sexual assault began. And that repeated. I never breathed a word of it. And that went on for a couple of years.
Now, there's so many things to address here, but in the wake of this, you talked about managing shame and dealing with it in all the different ways that you say you talk about in your book. In the wake of this, what did you think? How did you feel?
Yeah. I was so dissociated from what had happened to me. I knew that it had happened. I had no framework at 13 for understanding what it was. I can tell you what it wasn't in my 13-year-old brain. It wasn't about sex. It never occurred to me. In fact, it took another 2 years for it to occur to me that this guy got sexual pleasure from what he did to me. That was out of it just never occurred to me. He was a married guy with a son, a respected professional. It felt violent, and he was so dominant, physically large, dominant, scary. So most of my experience of it was just pure terror. And, for an adult, we hear child sexual abuse and we think sex, but for a kid, certainly for me, it was a near-death experience. In other words, the experience of being assaulted by someone twice your size. And again, this took me another 20 years till I was deep into therapy, and actually with the help of taking MDMA, I relived the experience and came to understand that it was a near-death experience. I describe in the book, at the moment of assault, of being outside my body, I observed the whole episode from above, looking down at the two of us as if I were watching it happen to someone else. Again, this is not uncommon, but my body, as if you can imagine being attacked by a grizzly bear, nature prepares you to die, right? You get this rush of endorphins, and your front brain goes offline. I had no power of speech. I couldn't speak. Again, something I didn't understand till much later, why I couldn't say a word. So the experience was really one of going into shock. And that happened to greater or lesser extents for the next 2 years, although that tapered off. And at a certain point, I understood that it was sexual from his point. But my framework for understanding it was really, to the extent that I did, and I imagined, fantasized that he had taken me hostage as some kind of blackmail scheme, and that if I breathed a word of it, he'd kill me and my family. And I just had my mind was spinning with scenarios of what this was and what it could be about.
How did this impact you socially and your family and school?
Yeah, interestingly, I was already a good student. I became an even better student, meaning, my personality underwent an instantaneous change. I mean, I went from being a pretty sweet, trusting kid to being hypervigilant, scared, reclusive, depressed, and I had no idea why. Again, I didn't make this connection consciously with what had happened to me. And my whole identity got wrapped up in performing well in school. That seemed to me the only way to sort of redeem myself and be accepted and be okay. But, beneath it all, I was really trying to disappear. So the fear of exposure, the shame is so intense, and the feeling of complicity is so intense. And I say complicity because, again, this is an aspect of child sexual abuse that's poorly understood, I think, partly because so few men write about it. There are so many great memoirs by women, that inspired me, actually. Very few first-person accounts by men. But one of the common features is the sense of complicity that happens at the moment of the sexual assault, because the perpetrator understands that the boy body is going to respond sexually to any touch. It doesn't matter what it is. You could, at age 12, 13, right, you could be pawed by a wombat and you're going to get an erection. That's what human physiology is. But that's the job of the body. And the perpetrator uses that to say, hey, look, you want this. You're inviting this. And so that is deeply confusing and triggers a sense of, oh my God, I'm responsible for this. And every guy I know who has been through this is haunted by that feeling of complicity. And that takes a really, really long time to look at and come to understand that, no, I didn't want this. And that was my body doing what nature prepares it to do, but this was against my will. And this is sex without consent, which is rape.
So this took place when you were 13.
Right.
Crucial age, what, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade?
Yep.
Throughout high school, do you cognitively, consciously, are you aware of what? Something happened? Are you more specific in your mind about what happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I knew what had happened, but this is really, of course, the body protects us by shutting off the feelings associated with the assault, right? Because otherwise, if I got up the next day and went to school, which I did, and was open to what had happened, I would have just been completely overwhelmed. But we were able to survive and move on because that's what we need to do and what nature prepares us to do. So the body, of course, this is classic, trauma. The reality of trauma is the body keeps it from the conscious mind so that we can function. And I did function. I functioned, though, in kind of a zombie-like state. I was immediately aware in 7th grade when I went back to school the next day that I was outside my life in some way, not inside my life. In other words, there had been some break in reality. I couldn't put words to it at the time, but it felt like I was watching my life from the outside and going through the motions without any kind of genuine the kind of emotion I used to have about being with, playing with my friends and having, enjoyment through that, and going to my clarinet lesson and liking it, and all these daily things I did in 7th grade where suddenly I had this strange detachment from, and it would take a long, long time to reunite those two parts of myself. I mean, it would take really until I was able to access all of what it was that I shut away and compartmentalized in my body, which was the terror and the pain and the shame. And once I was able years later to lift the lid and let those out very slowly and see and feel what had happened, then that zombie-like feeling started to fade and I was back in my life again. But that there was a long period where I wasn't.
Right. At what point did you seek help, and in what form did that come, and under what auspices was it?
Yeah, it was incredibly random. And again, I would encourage people to read the book only to see how random these things can be, because And I think a lot of readers read it and say, whoa, honestly, it's hard to read the book and not feel like the fact that I am here and didn't manage to perish along the way, either at my own hands or in other ways, it seems kind of improbable. And the way I got to, in my 20s, what happened was I discovered that the guy who had abused me had moved to another state, was running another camp, and was abusing other boys. Now, I had always assumed I was the only one. It just never occurred to me that this could have happened to someone else. And by the way, later, when I tracked down other victims of the same abuser, they all said the same thing, virtually all of them. Oh, I was sure I was the only one. When I discovered that, one thing that happened is I confronted him because I wanted to try to stop him. And if you read the book, you'll see what happened. That is very, very dramatic. But spoiler alert, he didn't stop and kept moving from camp to camp. At that point, I was still unable to go to law enforcement. And meanwhile, I had triggered the dissociation I had lived with since age 13 started to collapse because now I knew what this guy was and what he was doing. It was right in front of my face. He was sexually abusing 13-year-old boys. So I could no longer deny in my conscious mind what had happened to me. And what that did was, with my denial starting to collapse, I went into this kind of spectacular meltdown. When that happened, that I discovered that he was abusing boys, I was actually on my way to a PhD program in economics at the University of Wisconsin. And within 3 months, I dropped out of the program. I was shooting drugs. I was trying to take my own life. I just completely unraveled as I couldn't handle all the emotion that was just, coming at me from inside, all the trauma that was finally had escaped Pandora's box, as it were. So that led to this 4-year, sort of the lost years of trying to disappear myself, quite literally. And then I wound up in Southeast Asia in a refugee camp, and I was so sick, I really had a complete physical, mental breakdown. Went back to New York because I had no choice, and thought I had some physical illness. Everything was ruled out. A friend's father, who was a neurosurgeon, finally said to me, Stephen, I want you to see this psychiatrist. His name is Ken Greenspan, and he's a pioneer of biofeedback. So this was 1981, 82. I went to see Dr. Kenneth Greenspan, who ran the stress-related treatment center at Columbia Presbyterian in New York. I didn't know a thing about him. I'd never heard of biofeedback. I went in. This is after 18 months of trying to get some diagnosis of what was wrong with my body. He listened to my story for 10 minutes and he said, I'm glad you saw all those doctors. It's good to rule out any underlying diagnosis, but I can tell you right now, you've got shell shock. I said, well, what do you mean? Isn't shell shock from being in a war? I've never been in a war. And he said, well, that may be, but you're sleeping in one. Something's getting triggered during your sleep that is sending your mind into this cycle of terror and fear and really the body response, especially my gastrointestinal tract, was very severe, which is what was causing all the symptoms. So that was sort of the beginning, and I did a year with him. By the way, PTSD had just entered the diagnostic manual that year. And it wasn't, and even him, he was a big psychiatrist. He didn't use the term PTSD. And of course, it would be many, many years before it entered the parlance of most therapists. And this was New York, which was sort of ground zero for a lot of this stuff. They were still calling it shell shock. From there, when he saw that at some point he realized that all of this went back to some childhood experience, he sent me to a psychotherapist who I started seeing twice a week. and for many years. And in the midst of all that, and I still didn't tell this guy, I was probably in therapy for a year. I never mentioned the abuse. But then my perpetrator emerged yet again in my life. He had wormed his way into my family. This goes back to the beginning of the story, but he was good friends with my mother and my stepfather, and they invited him to my older sister's wedding. And that triggered, another episode of recognition. And that's when I really started dealing with it in therapy.
Wow. Okay. What point did you get to when you said, you know what, I've got to write? You're going through healing at some point, obviously, but at what point did you say, I've got to write this book?
Well, in 80, once from say 83 to 86, I was doing intensive, what I'd call classical talking therapy around this. The following decades I would do many other types of therapy, mostly somatic. But at that point, I was in talking therapy. And I also, in the midst of that, met a woman who would become my wife, who was the first. I had had many girlfriends, and I'd never mentioned this experience of my childhood to any of them. I just never felt, it wasn't a conscious choice. It was just my body didn't feel safe doing that. And I didn't know how to talk about it. So when I met Susan, she was the first who really got me to talk about it. And that was crucial, right? In having an open, trusting relationship. I'd never had that before. I had therapy. I had then just randomly, again, Susan and I happened to, an ex-boyfriend of hers was a chemist at a famous cancer research institute in New York. I won't name which one, but while they're doing cancer research, they were also manufacturing ecstasy, MDMA. This was 1985. We started, Susan and I, taking MDMA, not intentionally to explore my past, but that's what came up pretty quickly. And through a series of course, today, MDMA is being used in all sorts of clinical trials for exactly this, to get at trauma and to be able to face trauma and process trauma. So we were somewhat sort of accidental pioneers of MDMA back in 1985. And it allowed me to retrace what had happened without any fear at all. And that was huge because I got to witness and be with and process emotionally what had happened the first time I was sexually assaulted. And that was a huge deal because it allowed me to face it and accept that it had happened. And in my experience, once you do that, it loses a lot of its power, right? Because it's the fear that's driving all this stuff underground and kind of pulling the levers in your conscious day-to-day life. But if you can really look at what happened and be present with it and fully feel what you felt as a 13-year-old, then the grip starts to loosen. And so, it's kind of paradoxical, right? You have sort of reliving it in a very intense way, but that was a real gift. And that enabled me then to want to try to stop him and go to law enforcement. And that in turn led to this realization that I needed to write about it. And
how old were you at this point, Stephen?
At that point, I'm 30.
Okay.
Yeah, 30. So this is 17 years after it started. And the writing and the, working with the trauma would go on. Well, the working with the trauma till today. I'm in my mid 60s. I'm still working with it. It's a whole different thing now, of course, but it's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book now. And I'm glad that I waited. I used to beat myself up about not writing it in my 30s and 40s, but I couldn't have. I wasn't capable of doing it. And to me, part of what's so significant about doing it now is that I have a much wider, longer perspective on childhood trauma as a lifelong journey. And it really is lifelong. And I can see the arc of it much more clearly than I would have 20 years ago. You know, you can get stuck in certain phases of whether it's rage or, you know, guilt or whatever it is. But the longer and the further you go, you see that those are sort of stations along the way.
What do therapists need to know?
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, I think for therapists, I'd say first of all, the childhood experience, at least from mine and from many, many other, both men and women, victims of childhood sexual assault. The sense of the experience, as I was describing before, as being in shock or near death, that state of the body and of consciousness, or of consciousness separating from the body, which I hear over and over again, and the terror that comes along with it and can get triggered at any moment throughout one's life, and much less frequently for me these days, but it can still happen. The nervous system, and this is, I'm not speaking technically here, this is just my take as a non-expert. My nervous system got completely short-circuited that day, the first time I was assaulted. There would be many more times, but that first time, something happened deep inside the nervous system that it went haywire. And after that, it's never going to be the same. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that you can't go on and but one has to have and recover, because I feel like I have come a long way toward recovery. But I think it's really important to honor the profound damage to the nervous system that happens, which lies at the heart of all this, right? In terms of our psyches and how we express it and feel it going through life. And by that, I mean, there's an internal wisdom at work for each person in how to find their way to be with that and to heal from that. And every person's different, but it is a really, really deep wound in the wiring of the body and the mind. And so I think of course, the other aspect of that is just the whole issue of completely losing agency and control over one's body. The loss of sort of forever associating the first feelings of sexual pleasure with having no say in the matter. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of sexuality, it's just tremendously destructive, right? I mean, someone is taking your body hostage. Again, as something very tough to walk back later. Mm-hmm. It's there forever. So anyway, these are a few of the things that I think, for therapists, just to be cognizant that respecting the depth of those things and working with those, in my experience, usually means building trust, and that can take a long, long time, to build of course, trust is devastated when you're assaulted as a child. I didn't trust anyone again for a long, long time. And to this day, I have, real problems with, the sense of innocence or trust we might have in humans is really damaged. But it's funny, someone at a children's advocacy center, which are the centers in almost every city that work with child victims of sexual abuse, asked me, is there anything that could have gotten me to disclose at age 13, 14, or 15? this is a key question for people who work with kids, because of course it's very tough to get boys and girls to talk, but especially boys. There's a scene in my book where an FBI agent says to me, boys who have been abused are tougher to crack than murderers. You know, you try all the tricks and they just don't break, right? That goes back to that shame and fear and sense of complicity. And she asked me, was there anything that would have gotten you to disclose at age 15? And I said, no. You could put a gun to my head and I wouldn't have said a word, because I thought I would have been killed by this guy. So I mentioned that because what it made me realize was when I did finally disclose in therapy, it was only after a very long period of building trust with this therapist. It wasn't like I walked in, sat down and said, hey, let's talk about my childhood sexual abuse, right? And most therapists, of course, are quite familiar with this. It can take a long time for that to emerge. And I mean, I have friends right now, because since I wrote the book, who are disclosing to me in their 60s, who have never talked about it. So building a sense of trust in therapy, I think, way more important than going right at the issue. Even when the issue emerges, it's still all about, from my point of view as the client, it was all about assessing, testing, watching the therapist to see if I could trust this guy, right? Because the body is still saying, do not disclose to anyone or you're going to die. So, yeah.
As we kind of wind down here, Stephen, what were some of the things that helped you that some therapists did?
You know, I've had all kinds of, apart from talking therapy, I did bioenergetics, Rosen method body work, somatic experiencing, and sort of not things that you wouldn't necessarily call therapeutic per se, but sacred dance, obviously used psychedelics at various points. My approach has always been try anything and everything. And if it works, do more of it. So that's one lesson, right? And every person's different. So what works with one person may not work with another. EMDR may be great for one person, but zilch with someone else. To me, sort of the guiding principle of what works and what has been most helpful in working with therapists is that anything that helps you get at the truth, what feels real emotionally in the body is a good thing, and go there, pursue that. And that may be somatic work, it may be talking, it may be just moving the body.
So let me just interrupt you for a second. Yeah. So you're saying here that when you were working with therapists, when they were trying to get at the truth, that was helping you?
Yes. But as I said before, it's not, you may not, it's rare that you can go directly at the truth. Like, tell me what happened or what you felt when blah, blah, blah. Right. So because so much of this stuff, as we know much more clearly now than we did 30 years ago, is encoded in the body and may not be visible or known by the conscious mind. How do you find ways to access that in the body? Right. So talking therapy was fantastic for me in my early 30s, but I reached a certain point where it wasn't really revealing anymore. It got to a certain depth and no deeper. And after that, I began doing somatic therapies that let me actually start learning to feel what my body was holding and the emotions that were living in my body, and to release them. So that's, of course, therapists work in all sorts of different modes. And the reason I talk about truth is that I think the one, in looking back at it, that's sort of the theme that tied together all the different modalities I've tried, is that anything that worked was bringing me closer to the truth of my experience as a 13-year-old. And that could be, like I said before, it could be talking, it could be moving, it could be psychedelics, it could be, but anything that brought me in contact with the authentic experience was helpful.
Awesome. All right, Stephen. Stephen Mills, the author of Chosen, a memoir of stolen boyhood. The book is out. Where can people get the book? Anywhere?
Everywhere. I mean, they can go to, I think you're going to drop my website, stephenmillsauthor.com, but there are buy buttons there for Amazon, Barnes and Noble, independent bookstores. And actually, there's a fantastic Audible version. I got to say, I didn't read the book because there's so many characters and voices. I knew I couldn't do it. And Macmillan Audio got an amazing voice actor who did. I just listened to it and it really blew me away. I was like, whoa, this is an amazing story.
Well, look, I really thank you for coming on here. To me, it's friggin' courageous to write the book, to go through what you did, and to come on a podcast. And we need more courageous people like you to stand up and share their experience and their strength. It's awesome.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, Guy. It's really an honor.
Stephen, take care.
Yeah, be well.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.